Welcome to Steps to Maths, and today we will be talking about probability. Now, as I said earlier on in the week, I discussed probability and I said probability is a measure of uncertainty, or we could say it's a measure of how likely something is to happen. So, when we're looking at how likely something is, let's have a look at the example of throwing a coin. So there are two possible outcomes, and each outcome is equally likely. You're equally likely to throw a heads as you are to throw a tails. If we want to figure out how likely something is to happen, what we do to find the probability of a certain outcome, for example tails, is we count the number of ways we can get the tails, which is obviously one way. There's only one way you can throw tails when you're throwing a coin, and you divide that by the total number of possible outcomes. Okay, so a measure of uncertainty, how likely something is to happen. When the outcomes are equally likely, the probability of a certain outcome is the number of ways you can get that divided by the total number of possible outcomes. So if I throw a coin, getting a heads or a tails is equally likely. So the probability of getting one of those, for example tails, is the number of ways you can get a tail, which is 1, divided by the number of possible outcomes, which is 2. So it's 1 and 2. So that's it. If we want to measure probability, we want to figure out what the likelihood of something happening is we count. But counting can get quite difficult. So probability is just about counting. It's like I said, it's the number of outcomes that you want over the total number of possible outcomes. So let's have a look at an example when I have two coins. Let's have a look at what the possible outcomes are. So each coin is different. So for the first coin, if we get a heads, I'm going to put a little number 1 next to it so you know it's from the first coin. And if it's the second coin, I'm going to put a little number 2 next to it so that you know it's the second coin. So the number of possibilities. What are the possible outcomes if I throw two coins? Well, I could get two heads. A heads in the first coin and a heads in the second coin. I could get a heads and a tails. A heads in the first coin and a tails in the second coin. I could get tails in the first coin, heads on the second coin. Or I could get tails on the first or the second coin. So there's 4 possible outcomes there. Heads and heads, heads and tails, tails and heads, tails and tails. And each outcome is equally likely. So each outcome has a probability of occurring once out of 4. So the probability of getting 2 heads is 1 in 4. The probability of getting a heads followed by a tails is 1 in 4. The probability of getting 2 tails is 1 in 4. What about the probability of getting a heads and a tails? There's 2 of them. So there's 2 possible outcomes that we're interested in. So the probability of getting a heads and a tails is 2 out of 4. So again, just the number of outcomes you want out of the total number of possible outcomes. So as we saw there when we threw 2 coins, we had 4 possible outcomes. And in general, we have something called the fundamental principle of counting. And this is going to be our exercise today, is just to count the number of possible outcomes for something that can happen. And that is the number of ways the first thing can happen, multiplied by the number of ways the second thing can happen, multiplied by the number of ways the third thing can happen, and so forth. So here's an example question that you might have. A player chooses 2 cards from a deck of 52. The first must be a picture card, which is a jack, queen or king. And the second must be a number card, an ace to a 10. And the question is, how many different ways can such cards be chosen? Now for probability, you are expected to know that there are 4 suits in a deck of cards. That 2 of them are red, 2 are black. You're expected to know that they are diamonds, hearts, clubs and spades. But in each suit, there are 3 picture cards and 10 number cards. And there are 4 suits altogether, so there are 12 picture cards and there are 40 number cards. So, from the fundamental principle of counting, the number of ways you can pick a picture card followed by a number card is 12 ways that you can pick the first card, multiplied by the 40 ways that you can pick the second card, for a total of 480 possible ways to pick a picture card and a number card. Okay, so that's counting. And as you can see, if you're multiplying, numbers get big quite fast. But that's our first exercise. You just have to figure out, you just have to count up how many times something will happen using the fundamental principle of counting.